Dangote, 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 still them want money. I am so excited about today's episode for several reasons. But in the main because, when you work in like the world of business and you're trying to share market breaking news and content about what's happening in the world of business, Africa has such a limitation of stories you can share. And admittedly, maybe that has something to do with our research and where we pull data from, right? Because I think that there are a lot of business heroes in Africa who are every day doing amazing stuff that just doesn't get profiled. But today's story is not just amazing by African standards, it's amazing generally. And that's the story of ALIKO Dangote. ALIKO Dangote, or Alhaji Dangote, and the planned IPO of Dangote's refinery. It has so many elements that it actually, in my opinion, it would make for like a Hollywood thriller. Like it could be a very good Netflix series. By the way, Netflix, if you do this, you owe me royalties. It could be an incredible, amazing Netflix series that tells the story of Alhaji Dangote. The experiences that he would have had, the various places he would have started, the number of times he would have bumped his head against the wall, and just his transformative nature of how he's done business across the continent. Many years ago, his South African cementing business, I.P.O, was actually a client of mine. And we did some work with them at an executive level, and getting to meet his people, his team, was just the most incredible experience. And that, by the way, was before my first travel ever to Nigeria. That was before we started doing business in Nigeria. And that was before the good Lord had blessed us with the opportunity to do and build and buy businesses in Nigeria. So I say all of that just to make the point that I'm so excited to share with you guys a little bit about this planned IPO by ALIKO Dangote. Okay, great. So what are the headlines? First, Africa's richest man. Even if that was not the case before and it was in contention, it's definitely going to be the case after this IPO, because I just can't see anybody else who's going to be able to add as much value to their personal net worth over this period of time as ALIKO Dangote has. Maybe you could argue Nate Kirsch, but the Nate Kirsch transaction in Australia is now done, and we know what the numbers are there. And this planned IPO by ALIKO Dangote is going to, in my mind, be a game changer. So the first headline is, I think it's going to just really, really cement this Africa's richest man. Now, there are some people who will say, well, who cares that he's Africa's richest man? Maybe we shouldn't be measuring who's the wealthiest man on the continent. I don't agree. I think that Africa telling its own story in terms of wealth accumulation is important. And I think that Africa having strong representation of the kinds of people that create and accumulate wealth is important. And it's important not just for how Africa positions itself globally, it's also important for how young Africans see themselves in the context of the rest of the world. So it's important. It's important that these kind of stories become Harvard case studies, Cambridge case studies, MIT. It's important that we are also studied in the global context, and I think that's very exciting. So that's the first thing. The second is, it will be Africa's biggest equity raise to date. And that by itself is exciting. That's the second thing that you need to be aware of, which I think itself is going to be a massive, massive game changer for what this means. Let's take a look a bit at the core details here, because I think the core details are important. First, the IPO is going to be about 10% of the company's issued share capital, with a valuation between $40 and $50 billion. When I was doing the research and looking at the data, there are some reports that cite a $40 billion valuation. The Bloomberg report says circa a $50 billion valuation. So we expect that it's going to be a raise of anywhere between $4 and $5 billion that's going to be raised in a single IPO. And that itself is going to be record-setting, I think, for a number of the markets in the continent, especially markets that have tended to be shallow in terms of their capital raising activities. The primary listing is expected to be the Nigerian Stock Exchange. And more importantly, which I think is a huge part of the story that we're yet to tell, is how do you build a bridge, really a true bridge that connects the continent to the diaspora, in particular when you think about what they call the Middle Passage. Right? That's why in our firm, when we build a school of scale, as we launched the global exchange, there was big debate about calling it the Middle Passage. That has historical reference and historical depth, and the team kind of just settled on global exchange as something to really, really capture it. But the point here is, how do you bring on, in particular, the diaspora in the United States, but the diaspora generally? What's the money going to do? So what's the purpose of the funds? Well, they expect that some of these funds are going to go towards doubling the refinery capacity as well as quadrupling the fertilizer output. So there's huge work to be done here. I understand from a friend of mine who works at IBTC that they might be the transaction leads on this, and so it'll be interesting to see what happens. So that's the headlines. What do you need to know? Well, I remember vividly some time ago, I want to say 6-7 months ago, there was debates and uproar, and then of course a contestation between ALIKO Dangote and the NNPC. Of course, we now know that the then CEO of the NNPC has since moved on. The NNPC, by the way, actually owns 7.5% of the refinery, and that contestation was really around what does the hydrocarbon energy mix in Nigeria look like generally. It was a much broader, bigger debate than a lot of news outlets refined it, right? When you're writing a newspaper, typically what happens is you have a limitation of words and you've got to have a story that you need to tell. So you want to get to that story fairly quickly. But for anybody behind the scenes, the conversation was much bigger. It wasn't just about their shareholding. It was also to do with the hydrocarbon energy mix. It was to do with operational expertise and who gets to operate the refinery, who actually gets to own the refinery, how much does there were a couple of really, really complex issues. But I didn't know until recently that Aliko Dangote's empire spans 12 African countries and employs 30,000 people. Just download those numbers. And that's one of the things that excites me about building businesses in Africa, right? Like when we build businesses, we have to build businesses that are transformative by nature, that change society by nature, just because that is the nature of where our continent is. And his group revenues are anywhere between $3.3 billion to what is now $18 billion in recent years. There's a long-term target to get those group revenues to around the $100 billion number. I think, time allowing, probably the next 10, 15 years, it's not inconceivable that this will actually happen. The refinery, and a friend of mine, Dr. Ned, actually went to the opening of the refinery, and I was so jealous. I wasn't invited. I would have loved to go, but I also was traveling at the time. But I remember him sending me images, walking around the refinery on the day that it was open. It was a huge fanfare. But that refinery is now at something like 650,000 barrels per day. It's currently the world's largest single train refinery. It's located in Lekki, which is in Lagos in Nigeria. It was built at a cost of circa $20 billion. So this is huge money. Like for those of us who operate in investments, that's a very deep and a very long J curve, right? And by the way, they're still not out of the J curve, but the fact that he was able to do it is itself a game changer. It's now fully commissioned, right? And I beg your pardon, when it's fully commissioned, it'll transition to about 100% Nigerian crude. And that, of course, was anticipated to be by the end of 2025. I think that's been pushed out by a quarter or two. My numbers are not necessarily most up to date on this. There is an expectation post-I.P.O. that they want to double production to around 1.4 million barrels per day, which itself is going to be a huge, huge game changer. For those of you wondering, and I know some of you here are, what does this mean from a valuation context? But most importantly, what does it mean for ALIKO Dangote's actual personal net worth? This is the gossipers in us, right? Those, if you're curious. So his current net worth is between $28 and $34 billion, give or take. And that's largely from his industrial assets. That's before the refinery ramp up, which will have a substantial kicker. There are some numbers I've seen that says that once the refinery is probably kicked up and the shares are publicly trading, that his net worth should bump to between $36 and $45 billion. What a number. Like, that's GDP of small countries kind of number. That's game changer number. So that's a boost of, $20 to $30 billion in paper value of his personal net worth. That's massive. That's huge. That's absolutely huge. But like all things, there are risks. So what could go wrong? Well, the first is kind of execution and operational risk, although admittedly, I think that the team that's been driving it has done an exceptional job to date. But they've got to hit that. They've got this target of 1.4 million barrels per day. So that's the first. The second is the market valuation risk. It could be overhyped and overheated, and the stock could fall flat. I don't anticipate that that'll happen, but over-optimism has been known to be a pre-IPO risk. Here for me, though, is what's most exciting about this opportunity. This is what's most exciting. If you study the history of economies, there is no path to a developed economy that doesn't include industrialization. That path doesn't exist. And I forget the author now, but he wrote the book Kicking Down the Ladder. He's an Asian author. And one of the points he makes is that Africa has been sold this lie that you can go directly from primary industry to tertiary industry without building industrial capacity in the secondary industries, right? And that just doesn't happen. And so my excitement with this planned IPO and with the success that has been in the refinery, but also just the success generally across the Dangote group, is that it's been focused on secondary industries. It's been focused on building the industrial base. And Africa has to build that industrial base. It can't just be that we're still going from pit to port, where we're pulling things from the ground and then sending them to the port to beneficiate elsewhere. That's got to now be done on the continent. This could fundamentally shift and change the game. Why? Because it could shift and change the dynamics of what sourcing energy for the continent looks like. That's what I meant by the argument was actually a broader hydrocarbon energy mix conversation. I saw the recent commentary and discussion between ALIKO Dangote and some presidents in East Africa. I want to say Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda, who were talking about, well, can we build a refinery here? And I think there are plans to build it in Mombasa or something like this. So the idea is that other African leaders are going, hold on, wait a minute, we should actually be industrializing our base. As a South African, this has always been the strength of the South African economy. From where I'm sat in my office right now in Sandton, if I drive from here to the airport, what I drive past is industry. It was factories. That's all that Boksburg was at a point in time. That is all that Kempton Park was at a point in time. Jet Park was literally built as Jet Park for the industrial base. So too were many other parts of South Africa. And so the deindustrialization of our economy has also resulted in the low labor absorption rate, which is in part driven up the unemployment number. So what you want is to re-industrialize your country. This is the game. This is why in a current fund that we're raising at 154, the fund that we're raising is an industrial focused fund. It's about buying industrial base of family-owned businesses that are in transition for next generation, professionalizing their management team and helping them scale and build those businesses. There is no other way to build Africa except by industrializing. And I want to say to the team at Dangote and to Alhaji Dangote himself, thank you so much for the work that you do, for the incredible light that you are, and for the battles that you fight, many of which are behind the scenes, which, those of us who are not aware of just might not be aware of. But for every headline, there has been countless conversations, discussions, fights, debates about how something gets done. And to execute it at this scale and this well, game changer. Game changer. Suddenly, the rest of the world looks at Africa and can see some bright sparks and some lights of potential and execution. What a win. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you think. I'll see you on the other side of this. Cheers.